My name is Evan Starling Davis. I am the graduate assistant for the Linder Center. I would like to thank you and welcome you back for our next panel for the evening. I wanted to thank the co-directors, Marvin and Helene, as well as all of the panelists today. The conversations have been amazing, super informative for me. So I'm definitely feeling the vibes and hoping that the audience out there are also getting as much as I'm getting today. I would like to introduce the next panel titled Creativity Equals Creative Activity. And the moderator for the evening for this panel, which would be Dr. Tanisha Jackson. Dr. Tanisha Jackson joined the African American Studies Department in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Syracuse University as the Executive Director of the Community Folk Arts Center, which is a local arts center here in Syracuse, New York. It's been around since the 70s, and as a professor of practice in the African American Studies Department in the spring of 2019. At Syracuse University, Dr. Jackson teaches classes in African diaspora art, including art of the Black world and contemporary Black film. Her research focuses on the representation of Black women, wellness in contemporary art and popular culture in multimedia and community spaces. She has published peer-reviewed articles in international and national organizations and publications, including Me Telling, Recovering the Black Female Body Through Digital Narratives and Mixed Methods, Visual Culture and Gender Journal from 2013, as well as an article titled Visual Images in Worldview in the Self-Reflective Millennial Space in the Journal of GART 2018. Jackson's other research focuses on community-based arts education in the African diaspora, in which she focuses on shared asset-based strategies specific to the social justice initiatives that work to build community and address inequities in marginalized spaces. She earned a PhD in art education, an MA in African American Studies, and a BA in English, all at the Ohio State University. She also earned her Executive Master of Business Administration from the University of Toledo. Welcome, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Evan, for that introduction. It's good to see you online. Evan failed to mention that he's also a proud board member of the Community Folk Arts Center, and it's always good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited and also honored to moderate a panel discussion with esteemed colleagues and professionals within our local community here at Syracuse, where we're going to talk about creativity or creative activity as it relates to engagement. And so what I'd like to do is just jump right into it by first introducing who our panelists are. I'll start with Cjala Surratt, who focuses on cultural equity and restorative justice, emphasizing socially engaged practices, site-specific projects, and public interventions. An alum of the Syracuse City School District and Syracuse University's College of Visual and Performing Arts, she has worked in public relations, marketing, and community outreach for various arts, cultural, and social justice organizations for the past 20 years, among an array of titles as PR and marketing director at organizations like Red House Arts Center, Lightwork, and Urban Video Project, as well as the Community Folk Arts Center. And she also is a wonderful board member serving currently with the Community Folk Arts Center, all here in Syracuse. Surratt serves on the Everson Museum of Arts Members Board and Racial and Equity Task Force, the Arts New York's NYS Commission, and Community Folk Arts Center Advisory Board, as I mentioned. She is also a co-founding member of the Black Leadership Coalition and Black Artists Collective. Both endeavors seek to center the concerns of the Black and Brown community in political and cultural spaces with a focus on equitable distribution of city, state, and federal funding. Next, we have Sarah Gentile, who is the Director of Fine Arts for the West Genesee Central School District. In this capacity, she oversees programming for visual arts, theater, dance, and music. Previously, she was the supervisor of fine arts in the Syracuse City School District for 8 years. As an administrator, Sarah brings her passion for arts, education, equity, and belonging to a district level. Prior to the move to administration, she works as a music teacher in the Syracuse City School District, teaching vocal, general, and instrumental music at all grade levels. Currently, Sarah is a doctoral student studying equitable educational leadership at Syracuse University. We also have Kimberley McCoy, who received a BFA in Arts History from Syracuse University. During her time at SU, she became involved in several campus-based activist groups that sparked her passion for art and activism. She later received a Master's of Science in Arts Administration from Boston University. Excited about Art Rage Gallery's mission to combine art and activism, she returned to Syracuse in 2009. In 2010, she was hired as the community engagement organizer. And last but definitely not least, we have Rochele Royster. Dr. Rochele Royster is an artist, art therapist, and educator. She is an assistant professor at Syracuse University in the Creative Arts Therapy Department in the School of Visual and Performing Arts. Previously, she worked in Chicago Public Schools for the last 19 years, integrating art therapy into the educational setting, and has worked with youth, adolescents, and young adults with various learning differences such as autism, traumatic brain disorders, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. She has a PhD in community psychology from National Louis University in Chicago and holds a master's degree in special education and another master's degree in art therapy and a BFA in studio arts. Please welcome this panelists and thank you for your participation in advance. Okay. So I'm going to open with a question for each panelist. I would like for you to please share your connection to today's theme, which is creative activity. How did you come to this work? And if we could, Rochele, begin with you.
Yes, hello, and thank you for having me. So creative activity, how I came to this work. I would say that creative activity or art action has always really been a big part of who I was growing up. I lived on a farm, so I made dolls out of rags, and I watched my grandmother quilt. So it was always something that was very integral in my upbringing, but also as an adolescent, it was something that I tended to fall back on when I needed any type of identity development or comfort, I guess. So moving forward, I studied art in undergrad. My parents are both teachers, and I decided to go and get a teaching certificate because I figured if I couldn't do art, then at least I can teach art. What I didn't realize is how much I would enjoy the classroom, how much I would enjoy education. And I had a great mentor who was a special educator who just created these classrooms where art was a it wasn't an afterthought, it was a very integral part of the curriculum. I think about something that she would say, people, always say to artists, well, I can't draw a straight line. If I said, well, I can't read a sentence, you would look at me like I was crazy, right? We kind of have to shift the way that we think about art, about the way that we think about art education and the way we structure our classrooms. And so my pedagogy really started to develop then. How can I create a classroom that is safe, that addresses academic needs, that addresses social needs, emotional intelligence. How can I create this classroom? Because when we ask students or anyone to be creative, or we ask them to self-actualize or think on this hierarchy, think about Maslow, right? And the hierarchy of needs. At the very bottom of that triangle is your physical needs, right? Home, shelter. Above that, you have your emotional needs. So love, a sense of belonging, safety. Above that, you have your self-esteem. And then above that, right at the top, you have self-actualization, which includes that work of creativity. So in a lot of instances, a lot of spaces, we're asking people to jump all the way from the bottom to the top, to ignore being safe, because a lot of people don't feel safe, to ignore the fact that they didn't eat this morning, to ignore the fact that they feel really crappy about who they look like or about being Black in America. We're asking them to jump way up there to this idea of self-actualization. And that's why we see this divide between the privileged and the non-privileged, because when you have all those needs met, it's easy for you to grow in those ways. So my idea was, how can I create this ecosystem within the classroom so that whatever might be going on at home that's not necessarily safe, how can I create that here within these four walls? And how did I do that? I did that by creating an open studio within the class where creative expression was allowed, where if people needed to go to the bathroom, they could go to the bathroom. If they needed water, they got water. I had snacks, I had lotions, soap. You know, I created this environment that kind of gave them that safety so that then they could feel safe and be able to create and be able to think about things in this much different way. So transforming the way that we see education has to happen. Oh, and I realized I just got off on a tangent there, I'm sorry. But that's how I got into this work. I saw a need and I fell back on what I knew provided me safety, which was art, which was creation, which was community. And I tried to interject that into my practice, and from the therapy room to the classroom to even my home. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. I think there's some couple things that I want to circle back to you on, or which may come out organically in the conversation. But just briefly, if the other three panelists can answer the question as well, and then we'll circle back around. So how did you fall into this line of work?
Well, I'll jump in. This is Cjala Surratt here, and I'm jumping in because Rochele mentioned quite a few things that resonated with me in terms of the idea of community and safety. So coming to this work, one of my entrees into arts was through school, and was through a teacher in my high school who made space for a young Black woman coming into her own to kind of explore. And so I'd say that was my first entree, was through education and through those different spaces, but also that my mother is a classically trained artist and musician. And so there were a lot of spaces that she took my brother and I into. And it was interesting, you mentioned the word safety, because as a classically trained opera singer, there weren't many Black or brown people in those spaces. So it was an interesting kind of evolving conversation around really wanting to be present in those spaces and enjoy those arts and know that it was a possibility for someone who looked like me, but also a constant conversation about ultimately what it might mean in terms of safety and being visible, or not being able to be necessarily heard in those spaces, and what that could look like ultimately if we raised our hand and said that we wanted to be involved. I'd also say too that my entree into arts was community. Here in Syracuse, New York, a lot of these kind of mechanisms and spaces are no longer here, unfortunately, but there were things like the Metropolitan School for the Arts, which was downtown, And it was essentially, across our city, across our county, people could come and explore different kinds of mediums of art. And so it was a space in which there was a cross section of people and you could explore. So that was really vital to me. And also the NAACP had a program called AXO, in which you came together here locally and you competed, and then you went to a national. So you got to see a lot of Black and brown youth who were exploring all different kinds of mediums and modes of performance and visual arts. And also then they brought in people like Spike Lee and people who would then see your work and you'd have an opportunity to go onto another platform. But I'd say in terms of creativity and entrees into that, it's very interesting because the word safety keeps coming back. And I think about the most vital experience for the work that I do now, because I went from doing the performing arts to being behind the scenes, is that I had an experience at Syracuse Stage in which I was sitting, with an audience. And there was a moment in which something happened on stage. I can't remember exactly what the performance was, but there was a collective experience. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. And I know before we started this talk, there was a woman who had her work up, Audrey Frank, Anastasi, and she talked about shared humanity. And in that moment, I saw that there was something that could go beyond necessarily all those different things that we have in other spaces. And there was an opportunity for conversation. And I find that extremely powerful and unique to the arts, in that it offers something that may not necessarily happen in our offices or in these casual other engagements that we have, that were afforded through the work of artists, a means to have some really difficult and challenging conversations. So that's.
Thank you, Cjala. And Sarah, would you please share your entree into creativity?
Sure. I grew up singing from, the moment I think I was born, but so music had always been a part of my life. And throughout high school, it became, we're going to circle back to that safety and community. Those words again, it became my safe place. That's where I found my people, and that I built community with the other people in the ensembles that I was a part of. But I did, as I went on to college, I did notice the duality that the arts have, right? It can be incredibly transformative and a really safe space and a place to build community, but there's also this elitism that the arts can elude, and so or exude, and so that has always been something that interested me, and was something that I wanted to work against, that elitism in my work as a teacher and then in my work as an administrator, so that all students can experience that safety and that community, and that experience in the arts can be available to all students.
Thank you. And Kimberly.
Well, yes, like the other panelists, I guess I always had an interest, a background in the visual arts. It was always a passion as a young person. And I think it was actually more of how social justice, the transformation of art and social justice that came along in college at Syracuse University. I became very active in activist groups on campus, specifically around when the WTO protests were happening in Seattle back in '99, and that really politicized me into the ways of the world and larger systems of power. And I was studying art history at the time and noticing throughout art history how artists have always been the ones to work for change and to challenge that status quo. And that really got me involved in the intersection of social justice and art. And that's, I guess, sort of the Art Rage Gallery in Syracuse on the north side is exactly that intersection. We're a nonprofit gallery that exists to exhibit the work of artists on social justice and environmental themes. So I've really found that those two passions have kind of collided in this space. And it's all about bringing community together to create conversation about the issues in the art.
Thank you. Yeah, what I find interesting is how all of you are connecting in very similar ways, and how you engage art as a, art is a vehicle to cultivate a space of safety, to provide resources, but also to address community needs that are centered on social justice. And so I think this is a nice segue, because for the next question, which is, what happens when we boldly proclaim that creativity or creative activity is a human right and not merely a privilege? And this question is for anyone who'd like to jump in.
I think it's a very interesting moment in which you ask that question too. I've been in several rooms in which I think the world, as we went through the pandemic, agrees. Absolutely. It was through the arts. I think, through our singing and dancing and Zoom sessions of doing all different things, that we help the nation keep its sanity. But I think it's interesting too, that while we hold that, we also are now at an interesting crossroads of, again, returning to our individual institutions and finding that we still are fighting on our federal, county, and city levels to get dollars flowing into our institutions and making sure there's proper evaluation, not just of the works, but of the individuals and who are making the work and the labor that is happening. So I think that for me is a very kind of interesting tension and crossroads that we're at, because I think that unanimously there is an understanding that since someone put their hand in the clay and put it on a rock, that it is an intrinsic part of who we are, but also it's an interesting tension because, again, finding the equity and the attention and making sure that dollars are actually flowing into our institutions to make sure that arts is supported is another conversation.
Mm.
I was thinking along those same lines as well. I think anytime in the K-12 education world that you proclaim that, everyone agrees, from parents to students to teachers. Everyone's like, yes, absolutely, everybody should be involved in it. But when push comes to shove, and we have, the state guidelines or assessments or time or whatever resources we're talking about, and you want people to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, that's when oh, well, maybe we don't all agree as wholeheartedly as we proclaimed to when the statement is first made.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to add to this?
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to add, I was thinking about the idea about what we're going through now and how people have really relied on art to kind of get through these times, but it's been intrinsic to who we are as people, to reclaim that human right. Even though we don't boldly state it, we have always fought tooth and nail to reclaim our human right to see our own humanity through art action and through creative activity. And I go back to my great-grandmother who did quilting. That was her reclaiming and saying, this is my human right to make something beautiful, to make something out of nothing. I think about dance. I think about cooking. It's intrinsic to who we are as humans, to survival, to reclaim that. So of course we need to boldly state it, right? But I think we always have. The divide is the power, the money, the capitalism, the white supremacy that has created this lack of resources, so that not everyone has equitable access to the arts. But we've always made good with what we had, I guess, as a people, and resisted in that way.
Yes, and so it's really interesting. Before I go, Kimberly, did you have anything you want to contribute? Or or say, I should say.
So, I'll just add that, yeah, I think it's a lot about access. I think that we can all agree that for us, it is that creativity is a human right. And the next step is how do we make sure that we all have access to that. So I think that that's, I'm in agreement. So much of that unfortunately it does seem to have to do with funds. But I think thinking of, how at Artreach, for example, that has always been the major question of how do we make it as accessible as possible to all people? How do we break down those barriers? So Sarah earlier was talking about this kind of the elitism that's seen in the art world about who is welcome. And I think that really challenging that and going beyond to making it as accessible as possible is the answer for it to be a human right.
Yeah,
I was just going to say off of what Kimberly was saying is that I think the accessibility issue is a major one. It's a major component because I've watched conversations about or real recognition about economic disparities and what the implications have been of that. But we've had a parallel experience in the arts community. So if there have been people who have been historically excluded from these spaces, then we then see a ripple effect in the valuation of works and who's choosing the works, there's a whole entire larger system that then is about accessibility as well. So, but thank you for bringing that to mind, Kimberly.
Yeah, I think these are incredible points that you all are making, accessibility, the funding, the equity. And as each of you were talking, I was reminded of a conversation that I had about, people put their resources towards what things that are connected to their intrinsic value, right? And so when we think about, human rights, the human right to create, it's so interesting that, and I think, Cjala, you brought this up, that it was during, I think that at the height of the pandemic, that it was the arts, rather it was delivered virtually or elsewhere, that really helped for human connection, right? For us to be connected and to say balance and sane, I would say. And oftentimes what's so interesting is that a lot of those activities were delivered for free, which kind of, challenges where we're at now when we think about the funding or the lack thereof. So it's an expectation or a need at a very human level, but then also it needs to be supported. So thank you for your thoughts. The second question I have for our panelists is, how do avenues for creative response open up space for individual fulfillment and higher achievement, interrupting the systems and structures of social inequity? So, we can't hear you.
I said it's a big question.
That is, and I can maybe break this up. So how do avenues for creative response open up space for individual fulfillment and higher achievement? I think that maybe we can break that up. And then the second, with the assumption that it interrupts the systems and structures of social inequity.
Well, it's interesting because it makes me circle back to the spaces that Rochele is creating in her classroom, right? Some of that interruption is being seen. Some of that interruption is feeling safe, because once you're safe and you know that you can then express yourself, you will then you'll take those values into all the other kind of components of your life, right? So I think that that particular piece resonated with me in terms of what Rochele was saying at the top of the conversation that we were having.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take that first component. Second part of that question.
Yes, absolutely.
I would just build on that to say that I think that creativity and the creative process is all about connecting with identity. And so I know with our students in our classrooms, like that's a big part of it. And so that in itself is a social justice practice in terms of validating and valuing students' identities and allowing them to maybe play with their identities a bit or explore different, parts of their personalities or their identities, and publicize that in a way that in a representation that they might not have been able to do before. And so I think just that in itself is a social justice act, but I do think it connects back to that safety and that community issue as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I do agree as well. Like creativity is a process, right? It's not just an outcome. It's a process, and it allows us to create our own meaning and find our own satisfaction in life, which is, fulfillment, right? It builds these skills social skills, is process oriented, builds character, and it allows you to share yourself with others, which builds community, which is important to breaking down those systems and structures of social inequity. I think about my reading class. So I worked with students who had neurodiversity, learning differences, and a lot of them were older students who were basically illiterate, had a really difficult time reading. And I really leaned on the work of Paulo Freire in that I wanted to meet them where they were and use their personal knowledge to build upon their own literacy. So having them start first with a creative response, drawing a picture or painting a picture first, and then moving from there and having them write about the picture or tell a story about the picture while I wrote it down for them. And then move it from there, have them read what they wrote, so that these were words that were coming out of them, out of a visual response, a creative response. And so it was kind of easier for them to learn decoding and the phonics, everything that was kind of preventing them from having access to that literacy piece. So when we think about fulfillment, reading is fundamental to feeling human, to feeling engaged in society civically. So using that creative response to break down those barriers so that they could have access to this literacy, to this reading, promoted them to this kind of fulfillment, this self-actualization. So I give that story as an example, I think, of what this question kind of looks at in a bigger kind of forest type of sense. And so that being able to read breaks down those social structures and that inequity. So.
Yeah, I definitely can see those connections. As Rochele, as you were speaking, I was thinking about within our community, some of the programs that we have. I know at the Community Folk Arts Center, we have the Creative Arts Academy, which is a building block for a lot of young people or their introduction into the arts. But we pair that with like tutoring, right? And so part of this is the connection of them getting what their needs met through their, regular or everyday curricula in school, but then also they get to engage in the arts and what they might perceive as fun. What I've often, I guess, observed and recognized is that connecting learning rather is directly through art, but then also, in association with other, subjects, if you will, that it increases students' achievement. And I think that especially those people, this is, at a younger level, but anyone, if you have a gift or a talent and you are recognized for that, or there's some sort of praise for that, that it heightens self-esteem and help and people in their assurance and their capabilities. And I think that's why a lot of the community programming that we have in our city is so important. And I'm just wondering, Kimberly, as it relates to Art Rage, I think there is a direct connection with the work that you all are doing when it comes to using art, as a means of interrupting systems of structures and social inequity. I think that you guys are right on the money when it comes to that. And so just want to acknowledge that work, since just focusing on, a lot of social justice issues as well in our community. So something that we definitely value. I'm going to move forward with our third question, which is, what are the benefits of centering our art and design practices and culture creation through a social justice lens?
Well, this is a bit tied to, I had the privilege of teaching theater for the Performing Arts Academy at the Community Folk Arts Center for some time. And one thing that came to mind when you were talking about that, I wrote, permission to show up as your authentic self is a revolutionary act.
Mm-hmm.
And in listening to Rochele and listening to you talk about, the young people that came through that program, I realized that before we could get into looking at scripts and breaking them down and all that kind of thing and talking about marks and what would happen, particularly on stage, was that coming out of the school system and all the different kind of barriers and masks and things that they had to do to make it through the course of that day, that there's a certain vulnerability that has to happen in giving of self between, for the work and for your partner in a scene. And ultimately that there was so much work that had to be done prior to doing that, that we had to really make space for them to be their authentic selves, that it was okay, that it was all right to be in that space. So I think about, in terms of social justice, that and its connectivity with the arts, is that so many times I believe that in curatorial activism, right, and that the works that you see on view, the things that you see on stage, that they're a conduit, again, as I said, for challenging conversations. And I think that most artists would say, there's some part of that is inherently interwoven into their work. And I think that is quite powerful. I had the privilege of over the last summer, we had people marching through the streets of Syracuse, for 40 days, and there were photographers out there who were taking pictures of that. And here at Lightwork, we ultimately showed some of those works of what happened over the course of that summer, and we also showed it through Urban Video Project in that corridor. And it was important. And it was important because why was it a revolutionary act? Why was it a social justice act? Because right there is the 15th Ward. Mm-hmm. So there's a connectivity between that justice corridor, where the jail system, where the jail is, and also people down there speaking about these injustices that were happening to Black and brown people in our city and across our nation. So it's finding those intersections and offering people a space in which they can use a work that they see, experience, or go to have these broader conversations. And again, I always say, I dare people to be uncomfortable. There are many, many spaces in which I am uncomfortable. So, use these different kind of offerings that artists put forth to think a little different. Maybe think about our potential complicity in some of these things in the system.
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of going off of that, using art to create these conversations, whether they be comfortable or uncomfortable, and also maybe of the keynote speaker earlier today talking about that art in the classroom doesn't just need to be fun, that going beyond that, having a deeper conversation. An example that we did at Art Rage that I thought actually was quite profound is that we had an exhibition of paintings. They're contemporary paintings, landscape paintings of places in America where lynchings had happened. Mm. And this is not the type of thing you would think that a public school teacher would necessarily jump on board of wanting to incorporate into the classroom. But yet through the artwork here, and they were able to see the students were able to see these paintings and create their own reflective artwork. Just learning about that experience, I think it was for many of them maybe the first time they had heard about the history of lynching in America. Mm-hmm. And the work actually was quite profound. We had it on exhibit with that exhibition. And just an example to me of something actually that's one of the, a challenging topic for elementary school students to learn about, that I think many schools currently there's conversations about that in this country, about what should be taught in school and what should be shied away from. And I think using that art has the thinking of new ways to teach using art can have profound effects in the classroom.
Mhm.
I think as a white educator, it's imperative for me to maintain a social justice lens because it would be too easy for me to fall back into that, white supremacy structure that I've been socialized in my whole life. And then as an educator, I wouldn't be seeing certain students, their authentic selves, or certain teachers that I work with.
Mhm.
And so I wouldn't be being the teacher or the leader that they need me to be. So in my own personal work, I feel like it's imperative for me to continually use that framework of social justice to be the lens that I look through for everything, so that I don't fall back into those practices.
Mm. Yeah, these are great perspectives. I'm wondering, as as each of you were talking, do you think that it is easier to interrupt the systems and structure of social inequity through the arts in a more community-based art setting? Or is there any difference, I'll rephrase that, between community-based arts versus in the schools? Because what I'm hearing is that there might potentially be like limitations, right? Especially when we think about the curriculum, and there's a pushback against things that are critical race theory, that's not really how it's interpreted is not what it is. But I'm wondering, do you perceive there to be more freedom in like community spaces that are community art spaces? Just curious.
Whose space? I mean, I guess whose space? I mean, I think that's one of the national conversations that we're having, right? Is there's a conversation, a corrective, a restorative conversation about whose space, who owns it, who runs it, who's on the board, who's the executive director, who's choosing the work. I mean, it's top to bottom. I mean, I applaud the many institutions that are, selling work or doing those different things to make a shift. But ultimately, still, I'm looking at the larger system of who's sitting at those tables. I'm not sure. We can return to the question. I also think it's interesting because I think the valuation, it's a difficult thing because, as I said, education was one of the places that was my entree into the arts. But I also see, and it gets a little frustrating at times, at least in spaces when you're talking about funding, that the valuation is definitely about education and economics. If you can't put arts into those two boxes, then we necessarily can't get to that intrinsic inherent value of the arts. That if it's not tethered to those, and I saw through programs like Partners for Arts Education, which was an amazing organization here in Syracuse, but we had a lot of artists, I should say, that isn't part of their practice. They are not teaching artists. They don't know classroom management. That isn't necessarily that they wanted to do, but that was necessarily how they got funding. So it's these different kinds of difficulties and things that have to be maneuvered that I think are problematic. But starting with which institution, who's at the table is often the first question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just want to say, whose space, all right, because I felt that was about to be a song. So yeah, it's like breaking down, liberating these institutional spaces, right? Whose space is this? It's the community space, right? It's our space. We need to reclaim those spaces. And how do you do that? You do that through art. You do that through music. You do that through culture. You do that through food, something that is innate to all of us, to our core, and that feeds us, right? And we bring that into our space, because whose space? My space, our space, okay?
Absolutely.
Yes, all of that.
So I know I have to go on to the next question, but I just wanted to, mention something. It was so interesting. Again, I'm always in these conversations where with different creatives and artists, and there seems to be like this divide between people who oftentimes who sees art as a means of, for example, for social justice, but then there are people who say, well, what about art for art's sake? You know, just focusing on the aesthetics of art. Does it play an important role in our community or in various communities? You know, does art always have to speak to social inequity? And if it doesn't, is there less value? That's for anyone. Or what role do you think, you know, just arts for art's sake has, if any, you know, any in our society at such a, I would say, a critical time?
Yeah, I think, you know, the answer to this question is yes and no, I think. So yes, I mean, art should be relevant to what's going on in society, right? It should be relevant. It should promote social change, but it doesn't have to. You know, sometimes you just want to create a picture because it's meditative, it's soothing, it's about the process, not about the outcome. It's about the journey, not getting there to, you know, not arriving at the destination. And so I think that that's a really interesting question. Why do we do art anyway? You know, what is our intrinsic need to create? What is it that makes us want to put a mark on paper? What is it? You know, and what is it that makes us want to make things special? It's just what we do, I think. I'm interested to hear what other people have to say about it. But I think, yes, there's two, and I am a community-based artist, so I really believe in using art to bring awareness to social determinants of mental health. But also I do art because I want to, and I want to feel good. Maybe I'll hang it up on the wall, maybe I won't, it doesn't matter. It's more about process for me. But, you know, it's up to the individual, I think. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what others might say.
Well, I'll add to it and then we'll move forward. No, I think process is important. And one of the reasons why I raised the question is because I think there's these invisible values, right? Benefits that oftentimes aren't explored. So if there's not a practicality to art, if it's not, or people may not necessarily understand or, the messaging behind it, then it's like, well, what is this? But process in art is always important, especially for the individual. And so, and that's a whole other, I think, vein of thinking, like, who are you creating for? Oftentimes when I speak to artists, the general, answer is, well, first I'm creating for myself and then I'm creating for others, not necessarily for, the social justice message, for a broader audience, but just working out how I feel about what's going on in my community through the process of making art. And I think that should be acknowledged.
Yeah, and also thinking about, art making, research shows that making art really reduces stress. It reduces cortisol, it releases serotonin levels. So it gives you that good feeling, the endorphins, releases endorphins. So there really is a physical response that your body has to making art. So when you're creating these things, whether it's from dance to movement, to sewing, to knitting, to actually creating a picture, quilting, you are releasing these chemicals in your body that reduces stress, reduces anxiety, and just makes you overall a happier, more joyful, find that radical joy in your life. So I think intrinsically, that's why we do art, because it feels good. It feels good to us.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on to the next question, which is, what practical instructional tactics and partnering strategies, right, are essential in promoting an equity-oriented ecosystem of creative activity. Also education and social entrepreneurship. So what practical instructional tactics and partnering strategies are essential in promoting an equitable oriented ecosystem of creativity, education, and social entrepreneurship?
So my first thought when I read this question ahead of time was about design thinking and the design process, and in terms of curriculum. A lot of times in education, folks are handed a curriculum and told to implement it, or, you know, given professional learning opportunities to learn how to implement it, but they oftentimes did not have a hand in the creation of the curriculum, and how important it has been in the curriculum work that I've engaged in to invite educators to be part of that design process, and the learners as well, students as well, I think should be part of the design process to develop the goals and the learning processes that will support the curriculum or the works that they'll be doing. And so I think that having that design process and having folks engaged in that is a really important part of being a tactic to use or a strategy to be to promote equity and social justice within the classroom. I think when you start to exclude the people that you're supposed to be serving is when you start to run amok of doing equity or promoting equity and social justice within the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely can see that we're like participatory, strategies are, definitely more optimal. Anyone else?
I wouldn't just say optimal, I'd say essential, mandatory, mandatory, because there are so many tables at which, I've had the privilege of sitting at. And, but some of them, I sit at them out of fear, for fear that if I leave, I'm not sure necessarily what the outcome will be, because oftentimes I find the kind of long-term legacy implications of those choices made at those tables aren't thought of. So I think that Sarah was talking about, participatory kind of process, I think is absolutely essential. When I, do my marketing and public relations here, I think about who are your people, where do they gather, and who is their messenger? And it might not be me, and that's absolutely fine. Who are the trusted messengers? To also then, before you start a process, not once it's on the wall, not once you've sold the tickets, but prior to making sure if there's a particular community that's centered in those works, that you say, this is what we're looking at doing. Are we missing something? Is there a way that we should communicate this out? So making sure that it's not this kind of tokenized experience, for the works that you're putting out there. So I would say that, ideally making sure that you have people engaged in the process is the way to go.
And I would add similarly to that, I think you're talking about curriculum or like at ArtReach, thinking more about choosing exhibitions. It's a similar process of that the community being involved is essential, both in all the programming that we do, all the engagement activities are often in partnership with community groups here in Syracuse. To choosing the artists themselves, we have many of the artists that we exhibit. Well, first off, we try to exhibit at least half of the artists that are from Syracuse, from the central New York area, but also that we are kind of like an open book in terms of please suggest artists to us. That is how how many of the artists that are on our walls come to us as not through me just deciding who gets to be here, but through the community saying, you should do something on this, or I heard about this artist, or have you thought about doing an exhibition about this? Let's work together to find this artist. So that I think that just creates, it's creating community upon community of that if community is involved from the beginning, it becomes that's, I guess, the basis of a community organization, that it can really involve as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I think breaking down those power dynamics, checking yourself constantly, checking your own biases, listening to the community, listening to everyone from top down, to the top to the ground, and then differentiating resources. So putting support where it's needed, not necessarily everybody gets the same, but those who need the most should get the most support. And being an advocate for the arts, being an advocate for art therapy in institutional spaces, I think is also important.
And I was going to say too, I put down here, imagine, people cannot imagine themselves into these spaces or into these roles if they don't see it. I mean, there's so many times that I go into places and there's no one who looks like me. Maybe the work on the walls, right? But I also contend that Black and brown people have been always asked through the back door to sing and dance and do all the things, but to sit at the table and be decision makers is a whole different thing. And I think that's where right now there are real conversations happening. The other thing too is, as Rochele said, is thinking about our positionality. Absolutely. And there are many times too that there are people who are absent, but there are many reasons as to why they're absent or don't want to be at the table. So oftentimes it's making sure, I often say to institutions, we keep asking people to come to us, but when are we going out to them? And it's not for an ask, not going out for an ask, but going out just to say, how can we be of service to the thing that you're doing? And so oftentimes too, then if you have to stand in the gap or sit in the gap, then you're coming back to those conversations with some knowledge and some perspective.
Yeah, I love where this conversation is going. Especially when we're talking about strategies, and I oftentimes think about people who are doing the work that we're doing. If you are imposing a curriculum, or coming into a partnership with a determined idea of what the community that you're serving needs, or what are the themes, what are the artists, then that is not actually partnership, right? That is not participatory, and that is where people miss the mark. So that a real organic process takes place when you go and you ask, what are your needs? What are your interests? And that's what makes it more equitable. And I love the example that was given where, where organizations go out as a form of outreach and connecting and learning about the people that they say they're serving, as opposed to saying, well, we have these resources, didn't you know about it? Right? Did you know it? Well, no, actually, because there's a gap even within the channels of communication, where artists and people within the community don't necessarily know what resources are available, where to find them, how to access them. And so those gaps are very important in addressing, when it comes to developing strategies. And the same goes for curriculum. So I just want to put my 2 cents in concerning that. But I see a lot of head shaking and head nodding, like, yes. So,
Tanisha, can I say one more thing to that point? Is I'm thinking about, we recently here at Lightwork started saying, in addition to underrepresented and emerging, historically excluded. Because I think there's a conversation that needs to happen too about being intentional in our language, right? Underrepresented means we didn't see you there. Yes, you did. There were systems that kept people out. So historically excluded is much more about, now we've identified a problem, which means we are now going to collectively work towards fixing it. And I also think about this in terms of my job in PR, which it's extremely interesting. I recently reached out to a national funder because they rolled out a program in which they're doing mentorship for immigrant populations who are seeking funding. But the image that they put on Instagram, there's no one in that image who is identifiably brown. Now, are there people in that image that could be part of that diaspora that would identify as immigrant? Absolutely. But we have to be intentional. If we're talking about mentorship, we want to make sure that in the imagery and the language that we're using, that we're also making sure that we're communicating effectively. And I find too often, because again, who's at the table, who's crafting the language, who's looking at the materials, who's putting out the marketing. There are so many times I will tell you, there are things I do not attend, because if you send out your invitation, your announcement and all your PR and there's nobody that looks like community, then why would I give you my dollars? Why would I support that institution? So I think it's not just necessarily what's happening in terms of the performance, but all these other kind of peripheral things that happen within our institutions that speak to the issue of accessibility and gatekeepers.
Right. One of the things that I find interesting, because this conversation has shifted to, gatekeeping and having a seat at the table to, people who are empowered, right, who have the resources and can distribute them at the same time. And getting back to the theme of, although we've never really left, of creative activity, artists find a way, right? Artists are self-determined within the community, and they find a way to organize from the grassroots and to start to define themselves and to develop their own. And I think a really great example would be the Black Artists Collective here in Syracuse, where from the ground up saw a need, a gap, I will say, because of being historically excluded, which I like that. I'm gonna have to borrow that. I'll have to see who I need to cite later, but definitely that these, although it may impede exposure and access, it does not impede creativity. And I think that's what's so powerful, right, about the arts, that people continue to find a way to create and to get their work out there. But it could be, they could be so much more, I guess, supported, and their work could be amplified if society or social structures had their ducks in a row. But I'll get off of that. So anyways, I think we have time for one more question before we open up to a Q&A. And so I'm just going to go for it. Let's see. So how can we better coordinate our commitments to creative activity as a tool for self-actualization and the address of general and collective traumas, especially with marginalized and under-resourced local communities as we enter the post-pandemic era? I feel like I need to repeat that. That's a lot. So let's take small bites of this. How can we better coordinate our commitments to creative activity as a tool for self-actualization and the address of the general and collective traumas within marginalized and under-resourced local communities as we enter the post-pandemic era?
Yeah, so I just wanted to be really quick. I feel like we've kind of been talking about this whole time, about how the commitment there, the commitment piece, the self-actualization piece, but also how can we use the arts to address generational trauma and collective trauma bound from racism, and those type of things. So yeah, the push, we have to be advocates for arts. We have to structure our community spaces differently. We have to reclaim these institutional spaces, liberating them, decolonizing them. We have to connect with community members, collaborate with them, those who have been historically excluded. And we have to continue to resist, using art as that action, using community as that action. Because what does any type of trauma or violence do, right? It isolates, it breaks down community, it breaks down trust. So how can we build those things? How can we build trust, safety? I'm going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How can we get everyone's needs met? And at this point, it's not just an individual thing, it's really a societal. How can we create these safety nets so that people can find fulfillment and self-actualization and be creative. And I think we do that through the amazing work that we do as artists, as community workers, as cultural creators. So.
Anyone else?
I guess I sort of have a question for another panelist that relates to this. I feel like her answer might give us some insight. It made me think Cjala knows more about the Everson kind of, which is the art museum in Syracuse. So I guess our art institution, our local art institution has, I feel like, made a conscious some changes post-pandemic or post-George Floyd. And I know that Cjala's involved in some of that work. And I was curious to hear, and I'm not very involved in what the Everson is doing, but I think they have changed some of their messaging. And I'm curious if you could add some of your work about that and how that's going, and tell us about that.
Well, essentially what happened is that they did sell one of their several pieces of work from their collection, Jackson Pollock's, and that was done with the intention of diversifying their collection. Also, there was, in terms of looking at larger and broader systems, also then pulling together a race and equity task force, and that is made up of different components of the museum itself. So there's docents, there's members, there's board members. So all different kind of levels and strata of the organization are involved in a DEI process in which we did evaluations, personal evaluations, and we're doing collective evaluations so that we can ultimately figure out how to make it a much more robust, diverse experience for people who are coming into the institution, but also all the other components of the exhibitions, the collection, et cetera. So in terms of how it's going, we're still very much in process, because as I said, part of it was unpacking our own biases. And that's a difficult and painful process, because I think sometimes people think that they are allies or co-conspirators. And ultimately through this process, things are unveiled that are surprising. And so it's we are moving forward boldly.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how you feel about the critique that it's, this is a strong institutional move, but how does it directly impact, right, the marginalized communities? Like is there a connection between what some of changing these institutional practices that you just mentioned and people's everyday lives?
Well, I think one of the everyday life, first is recognizing things like part of the legacy of that institution is that it is within the footprint of the 15th Ward, right? So I think part of our conversation was recognizing the traumas that have happened in terms of the Indigenous community. We had one of the board members come and talk to us about that, but also recognizing that its proximity to, and it is a beneficiary of that history. So there was a conversation with one of the previous people at the institution about putting together a statement and that living on the website so that there's an understanding about that history. The other parts of that is inviting people in to ask, because we did find out in kind of larger conversations that there isn't a lot of community, local proximity community coming through the institution. And I think the great thing was starting with why. Not sitting around and pontificating as to, but really going out and identifying trusted advisors to come in and sit with us and find out why. Is it a financial barrier? Is it because maybe someone came through and had a bad experience? There are things like best practices. I know when I go into arts institutions that I'm going to be followed. There's the person in the red vest who's going to follow me, no matter where you go. But the realities are that for parts of our community, that signals something different. So how do we find a balance between those two different things? So it's unpacking kind of these minutia things, but also the larger systemic things about what is in the collection and how can someone access it? And do any of those works resonate with the community that you're inviting in?
Absolutely. We're running short on time, and I want to open up, it up for Q&A. And so I do see a question where someone is asking the panel to give a bit of focus on the work each of you do pertaining to youth engagement. And so if you can just briefly mention how you engage youth. that will be helpful.
Should I go first? So Art Rage Gallery is open to the general public, so we're not exclusively a youth based organization, but we do partnership with the city school district as often as we can, and we organize field trips for probably maybe more after school programs than in school programs. These days, obviously things are a little different, and we do a lot of engagement of events with adults as well. So we have done many programs where we work with a teaching artist in the classroom to engage with the creating a project around the themes and issues that are in our own exhibitions. And then we exhibit those works in the gallery.
Excellent. Sarah.
So in both my current school district and my former school district, equity of the programming for our students is at the forefront of my work, whether it be through curriculum work or through teacher training, and working with students directly to involve them in the work that we're doing at West Genesee High School. Right now, we have a student started and DEI group that's working on creating some professional learning experiences for teachers, for dealing with different, for teaching different historically excluded populations, and what teachers need to know, kind of entering into a classroom and holding space for those students. So it's very much work that we are trying to empower the students to be a part of, and they really took the reins in pushing the school district prior to me getting there, even into moving forward with this work. So it's exciting to see. But both in my work at West Genesee and at Syracuse City School District, it's been the focus of access and equity and belonging for all of our students has really been the overarching umbrella for all of the work in the fine arts department that we've been doing.
Wonderful. Rochele?
Yeah, so I've been working in Chicago as a art therapist and special ed teacher, integrating art therapy into the general curriculum there, but also building connections between public schools and larger cultural institutions like universities and museums, working through curriculum and civic engagement and activism. My last project was the Dolls for Peace project, in which CPS, Chicago Public School students, created a doll for someone who had been shot from gun violence. And so we processed and reflected and built a memorial out of dolls, using found objects to honor and bring attention to the impact of gun violence in the schools and in our communities. So
it's very powerful, very powerful. Cjala?
I'd say much of my experience, because light work is situated within Syracuse University, is with the student population here on campus that comes through for tours and to use use the photography lab and also look at the exhibitions. But I'm really excited because, of course, during COVID, we were closed, we were shuttered to the public. So I'm excited to, again, have student groups coming through from student organizations like we in the past had a Matilda Jocelyn Gage Girls Ambassadors program coming through, and they would use the Works on View to have a conversation that was tied to their programming. We also had the Southside Stand photography program. Those youth would come through and look at some of the works in our archive, which is very interesting because we have a residency program. And so in our collection, a lot of the artists and residents have come through since we've been around since 1978, have come through and taken pictures of the community. So it's really nice to pull out those works and for the students to see them, to see that to see the history going back that far, but also to see that there are artists who are coming here and seeing beauty and all sorts of different nuance in their community. So to be able to share that with them again has been really wonderful. We also have students who are coming from the Big Picture School, from the reservation, and we also have students who are coming, of course, from the Syracuse City School District. So it's really been nice. It's been rather quiet around here for a year. So I'm really excited to have youth coming through again, particularly to show them the dark room. I have to actually bring prop film with me because when I say the word film, they don't know what I'm talking about. They just hold up their cell phone at me and I tell them no. So I'm excited to have youth coming through our space again.
Great. And I'll add that the Community Folk Arts Center, I mentioned our Creative Arts Academy, which is Monday through Friday, where students engage in African drumming, dancing, 2D art, ceramics, as well as theater and, poetry. So it's a year-round activity. And then in the summer, we have the competitive teen art show in partnership with the Syracuse Links chapter here, and where youth from not just the Syracuse City School District, but surrounding areas submit artwork for scholarships, opportunities, and just acknowledgement of their creative work. So it's juried by professional artists and people in the community. I think we have time for one more question, which is, as this is a locally based conversation, thinking about city, town, at what level of policy and government do you see being the best potential pathway for art equity in our city? Could Syracuse be a model? How so?
Ooh. It's all the above. It's all the above. I have the privilege to, as was said in the bio, I work with the Arts New York Commission. During the last cycle of relief funding that happened, I had the privilege of being in the room with organizations across the state. And we had a lobbyist who was working and talking to both sides of the house, to not just say, give us the money, but also how we make sure that it is equitably distributed, making sure that those particular making sure that areas that don't generally see that kind of funding, that it does indeed get to them. So that there's the federal kind of component, there's your county component, but your local elections, your local representatives is a great place to begin, to make sure that indeed they know that arts is an important and valued part of their economic ecosystems, right? Because often that's the language that needs to be spoken in those spaces, but also to make sure that it isn't just centered in one community. I think now the word is we've moved from urban renewal to opportunity zones, but I really would like to see these dollars and our representatives looking at all different aspects of our city to make sure that that we're seeing vibrant cultural centers and corridors happening.
Okay, it looks like we are out of time. I want to thank each of our panelists for your thoughtful reflections as well as shared strategies and how we use creativity, right, as a vehicle for social justice, for equity within our community, and just for keeping us human, right? and creating a safe space for all. I thank you for the work that you're doing, and I look forward to partnering with all of you, since we're all in the same city for the most part, I think, right? We're all here. Okay. Thank you to our guests for listening to us, and take care.